and first introduce what we mean by ecology. Ecology is the scientific discipline that studies or considers the relationship between organisms, how organisms interact with each other, and also how organisms interact with their environment. Okay, so this includes both abiotic interactions, abiotic referring to the physical non-living world, and biotic or living interactions. That term, ecology, if we break it down, encompasses that definition. So eco comes from oikos, the Greek root of that word. Oikos means house, and logos or ology refers to the study of. So like the study of the house. And in this context, that house is referring to, again, the environment of a particular organism. Ecology has a long history as a scientific discipline, stemming early on from a focus on observation and description of the natural world. This definition I provided here by Ernst Haeckel is a wordier definition, and certainly not one you have to memorize, but I like some of the themes that it picks up on. So I'll just briefly read this to you. By ecology, we mean the body of language concerning the economy of nature, the investigation of all of the relations of animals, both to its inorganic and organic environments. Again, referring to the living and non-living world there. Above all, its friendly and inimical relations with those animals and plants with which it comes directly or indirectly into contact. So again, all of the interactions that occur between living organisms. In a word, ecology is the study of all those complex interrelationships referred to by Darwin as the conditions for the struggle for existence. We'll be talking more formally about evolution and Darwin in module 3, but there's a lot of overlap between the study of ecology and an understanding of evolution. The photo I have here, just to sort of emphasize the types of observations that ecologists may have or contribute. This is a female moose, a cow moose, that I observed this summer in Northwest Canada, Northwest Territories of Canada. And although I don't have her calf in this photo, her calf was nearby. And during the summer months, these moose will feed on aquatic plants. So you can see what's kind of wrapped around her snout here are some aquatic plants that are growing in this kind of roadside pond. And they go after food that has high salt concentrations during the summer. And so those pond plants tend to sequester salts. And they'll remain submerged for pretty long periods of time. So she'll put her head down and stay underwater, kind of eating a large amount of this aquatic vegetation over the summer. So again, her calf is nearby, so she's interacting with her calf. She's likely on guard, keeping an eye out for predators because of her instinct to protect her calf. And then she's, consuming aquatic plants here. So in that role, she's acting as an herbivore and impacting those plant populations. And her survival is connected with all of the different aspects of the physical world around her, including the temperature, the precipitation, as well as other food sources, other minerals and nutrients that she requires from her environment. Okay, so these interactions manifest at a variety of levels of ecological organization. And again, ecologists study these interactions at all of these different levels. Organismal ecology is also sometimes considered behavioral ecology. Focuses on an individual, so a single member of a population, and considers often aspects of behavior or physiology that, again, impact that individual. Populations, the level of ecology we'll be considering today, includes a group of individuals of the same species that interact live in the same area. Well, I'll elaborate on that definition a little bit more. Once we scale up from population, we consider a community. A community includes not just one species, but all of the species that live in a particular area. So this would be plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, every living component of a system. Scaling up from community, we'll consider the ecosystem level of organization. And this is a level we'll spend a lot of time thinking about throughout this course. Ecosystems include the living component, so it includes the community, but it also includes a consideration of the non-living or the physical world. And I mentioned these terms before, biotic and abiotic. And so it looks at how the biotic and abiotic components of a system interact. When we introduce ecosystems, we'll consider biomes, which represent these distinct regions of our globe. So we can sort of divide up the planet into biomes based on certain features of climate that I'll elaborate on in more detail, and the kind of representative or characteristic plants and animals that are associated with those biomes. But really we can scale up from here. So individual ecosystems are not completely isolated. Ultimately, there are connections as far as nutrients and energy go between ecosystems across the globe. So when we refer to the biosphere, we're thinking about the total area of Earth where living things are found, and potentially considering the interactions between those ecosystems or between those components. Okay, so that's our broad overview of the levels of ecological organization. And once again, in this lecture and in this chapter, we are focusing on populations. So let me elaborate on that definition I quickly rattled off a moment ago. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species. And we distinguish populations from other populations by the geographic area that they reside in, and that they are members of an interacting group that have the potential to interbreed, okay? And that's the defining feature. So your book talks about a classic example of population dynamics that have played out and are playing out in Yellowstone National Park with the introduction or reintroduction of wolves into the park in the late 90s. So there are wolves in Alaska and there are wolves in Wyoming. They are gray wolves of the same species, but we consider them different populations because they're geographically isolated. So they're not interacting with each other. They're certainly not interbreeding with each other. Okay, so even though they're the same species, they form distinct groups. Populations are influenced by a variety of different factors, and we are going to consider some of those factors in this lecture today. Population ecologists are often interested in characterizing the size of a population and the density of a population. We'll explain the significance of that. And there's a focus on how size and density may be changing over time. For example, going back to the Yellowstone wolves case study that I mentioned, the reintroduction of wolves into the park followed a crash of wolf populations and ultimately a disappearance of wolves from Yellowstone National Park as a result of predator control programs that were implemented by the government in the 1900s. So by tracking size and density, we can detect when a population is decreasing to critical levels such that that population likely needs protection or intervention to prevent it from going extinct. Population range, I'll talk a bit more about, but populations vary in terms of their overall range, how much space they occupy, whether or not portions of their range overlap with other populations, the distribution of individuals across space, we'll talk more about that, and then age structure and growth rate. We'll come back to some of these concepts when we talk about human population growth. So I should mention that here. In this unit, we're talking about the basic principles of population ecology, and then we're going to apply that to the issue of human population and overpopulation. So the issue of age structure, we'll talk about more in that context. For example, if you're looking at a particular region and the majority of the population is at pre-reproductive age, that would suggest that that population is growing, right? Because those individuals are going to move up into reproductive age classes and contribute lots of individuals to the population. So I won't talk about that too much in this lecture, but we'll return to that when we talk about human population growth. So population ecology is the study of all of these factors, again, in relation to the environment, how different environmental factors influence density, influence distribution, influence population size. So it's a very fascinating field, and again, one that has very clear applications to real world problems, including the management of declining or endangered species. Okay, so I mentioned range. So range refers to the geographic area where a population can be found, so the area that it inhabits. Generally speaking, larger mammals that occupy sort of higher levels in a food chain, we'll talk more about this, tend to have broader ranges because they require more area to meet their dietary needs. So for example, mountain lions typically as individuals have a range of over 200 square miles. That's how much space is needed to meet their dietary requirements. Bobcats, being much smaller cats, have a much more local, smaller range. So this is an important part in understanding population dynamics. Again, if you're following along with this Yellowstone wolf case study from your book, you can reference this infographic, which shows in the kind of darker red portion of this, the current range of wolves compared to the historic range of wolves. So you can have distinct populations, occurring within a range, especially when a species is broadly distributed. So, again, those Alaska wolves are not likely to come into very close contact with wolves in Wyoming and in the northern Rockies. There is also a small population of the Mexican wolf, which is a subspecies of the gray wolf that used to range much more widely through central Mexico and the Southwest. But its populations have also declined quite dramatically. But there is a reintroduction project similar to the project that brought wolves back into the northern Rockies that's occurring in Arizona and New Mexico. Okay, now across the range of a population, we can observe different patterns with respect to how a population is distributed across space. That has consequences for how individuals in a population interact. So population distribution describes the location, but also the spacing of individuals within their range, all right? So one very common pattern of distribution that is observed in nature is what's referred to as a clumped distribution. So these elk that you can see in this top example here tend to associate with each other and form kind of clumps across the landscape. Clumping is typically the product of or an outcome of strong attractions between individuals. So there can be behavioral reasons why individuals clump together. Think about, fish schooling. A school of fish is a clump, and it's behavioral attractions that result in a school of fish, right? The basic idea being that their survival, their ability to avoid predation is enhanced by being part of a school as opposed to being a lone individual fish. Clumping can also be the result of resource availability. So populations tend to clump around a necessary resource. So again, in an environment like in the Northern Rockies in Yellowstone, you can have species clumping around a water resource. So, prairie dogs or beavers will be in higher concentration, near a water resource. Wolves are highly social animals that exist in packs. That is another example of a clumped distribution. Okay, so groups or patches of individuals within their habitat. In contrast to clumped distributions, some populations will form a uniform distribution. I'm going a little bit out of order of your figure here, but you can follow along. So uniform distributions are ones where the spacing of individuals is such that they're maximizing the amount of available space across a habitat or across a landscape. So each individuals are spaced in a way that they're pushing away other individuals as much as they can, right? So these are also this is also often the result of social interaction. So territorial behaviors, for example, you can see, penguins or albatrosses nesting in a way that there's kind of the maximum amount of space between adjacent nests, right? And they'll defend their territory, they'll defend their nesting space. And again, that's a type of territorial social interactions. Plants do this as well. There are some plant species that produce toxins. It's a phenomenon known as allelopathy that inhibits the growth of potential neighbors. So it prevents plants from kind of popping up in close proximity to other individual plants. This is common among desert plants. If you've seen the way creosote, for example, grows in our local deserts, when you look out over the landscape, the creosote looks kind of evenly spaced because of this competition or the potential for allelopathy. In fact, this type of population distribution is often referred to as an even distribution. Okay. This is less common than a clumped distribution in nature. And then finally, the third example that's in the middle here is a random distribution. So in a random population distribution, individuals are spread out in a way that is irregular, that appears to not follow any discernible pattern. So, consider like a field of wildflowers. Sort of the wind randomly spreads wildflower seeds, and those seeds survive just where they tend to grow. Wind and water are important dispersal mechanisms for a lot of organisms like plants, but also like aquatic larvae of coral, for example. Because the movement of water and wind are random vectors, it can result in a random distribution. This one you have to be a little bit careful of because, even with random dispersal mechanisms, organisms like wildflowers can still clump around resources. So perhaps seeds are scattered randomly, but where those individuals succeed in growing are where there are sort of patches or clumps of nutrients in the landscape. So again, if you can show that there's no discernible pattern and that it is indeed random, then certainly it would qualify as an example. But sometimes with a random distribution, you have to ask some follow-up questions there. Okay. In addition to how individuals are spaced relative to each other, the overall size and density of a population is an important consideration when studying population biology. And we're going to talk more about how we track and predict how populations may be changing over time. Okay. So population size, of course, refers to the number of individuals in a population. In part 2 of this lecture, we're going to introduce some pretty simple mathematical models to quantify this, and we see capital N or big N as the indicator for population size in these models. So the number of individuals in a population. Population density refers to the number of individuals per unit area. Okay, so that gives us a sense of the size of the population relative to the available space. And that's really important. If population size and population density are too low, if it's below a minimum size for that population to be able to replace itself, that can create all sorts of different issues, especially for populations that exhibit, clumped type of distribution and environment. If the population gets too low, social interactions and behaviors can become deficient. It can be difficult to find and locate a mate. That would impact normal kind of mating behaviors and patterns of courtship. Another really important consequence of low population size is a decrease in genetic diversity. This is something we'll talk more about in the evolution chapter. But when populations crash, even if they recover, there are consequences from that recovery being based on a very small gene pool. It causes issues related to inbreeding. Again, we'll talk more about that. On the other end of the spectrum, when population sizes are too high, when populations reach a really high level of density, that causes problems as well. There can be increased competition because more individuals are forced to share limited resources. There can be increased kind of territorial battles or fighting. Disease tends to increase when there's a high population size because individuals are coming in closer contact with each other. So for example, in areas where predators have decreased, like wolves in Yellowstone, we have seen an increase in species like deer and elk and moose. An increase that is often referred to as a population explosion because that increase has been so significant. And there's a lot of problems that come along with having a landscape that's overpopulated with herbivores like deer or moose or elk. There's been an increase in infectious diseases among deer, a disease in particular referred to as chronic wasting disease. And it has consequences on other populations and on other species, for example, plant populations that get over-consumed by these massive herbivores. Right. So part of the motivation for understanding and characterizing size and density is to sort of understand and be able to predict what and potentially manage what occurs if a population is shrinking, if it's dipping below that minimum population size, or if it's increasing beyond its carrying capacity. And that's a term just kind of make note of for now. Is the limit of individuals of a population that a particular ecosystem can support. I'm going to define that more formally in a few moments.